A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's the multi-billion-dollar industry that's preying on the insecurities of young men with dangerous consequences. We'll explain what the Manosphere is and how it's changing our world. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Friday, the 23rd of January. A major manhunt continues for 37-year-old Julian Ingram, also known as Julian Pierpoint, after 3 people were shot dead and another seriously injured in the central west of New South Wales. The victims are a 24-year-old pregnant woman who is believed to be the alleged gunman's ex-partner, her aunt and another male. They were shot and killed at 2 separate locations yesterday afternoon. A 19-year-old male was also shot and remains in a serious but stable condition. Mr Ingham, a local council gardener, has a long history of domestic violence offences. He was previously convicted of a domestic assault in 2022. He was sentenced to a community corrections order and was under multiple apprehended violence orders at the time of the shootings. Court records show he was granted bail in November for stalking, intimidation, common assault and property damage and was set to appear in court on the 3rd of February. Police have confirmed Ingram does not hold a firearms licence. Assistant Commissioner Andrew Holland warned the local community to remain cautious while Ingram remains at large and to not approach him.
Maintaining them in their homes in a safe position if they can. They are free to move about the town whether they like, but again with exercise caution if they're moving about the scene. And if something unusual or there is a concern, please obviously call 000 or the police and we will assist you as soon as we can.
A large-scale manhunt continues with assistance from New South Wales Police tactical units, the Defence Force and Pole Air helicopters. The Prime Minister claims the Liberal Party has undermined its first female leader from the beginning as the chaos continues in the coalition. Anthony Albanese also predicted there will be more defections to One Nation. Meantime, the Liberal leader Susan Lee is insisting she will survive mounting pressure on her leadership. Miss Lee says the strongest leadership contenders, Andrew Hastie and Angus Taylor, both support her as leader. Surviving one of his toughest weeks as Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese has told the ABC Labor is united and the opposition isn't.
The coalition are just focused on themselves. It's all about their internals. And, Susan Lee has been undermined, the first woman leader of the Liberal Party, undermined from day one. And the alternative leaders are worse.
The Nationals quit the coalition this week for the second time since the federal election less than a year ago after a dispute over Labor's hate speech laws. And a number of New South Wales beaches are set to reopen this weekend after 4 shark attacks earlier this week. Ahead of hot weather expected this long weekend, authorities will still be closely monitoring water conditions and also using drones and other surveillance systems to spot any sharks. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the concerning rise of the Manosphere, which is influencing tens of millions of teenagers and young men across the world. Joining us to explain why this new world fueled by social media is so concerning is radicalisation researcher Vivian Gerrard from Deakin University. Vivian, thanks so much for joining us. First question, can you explain to us what is the Manosphere?
What is the Manosphere, or what are manospheres? Well, the Manosphere really is a loose collection of men's groups online that have some element of anti-feminism in them. So the Manosphere was first talked about around a decade ago and theorised by scholars like Debbie Ging, who's one of the co-authors of this piece and of the study that I've been involved in over the past couple of years of the so-called Manosphere. And, really, we know that anti-feminism is nothing new. Men's rights have been around for a long time. But the ways in which the internet has enabled them and connected them is what's unique about the so-called Manosphere.
I love that you've immediately mentioned social media because I think that is such an integral part of a lot of issues and concerns we have in our society at the moment, especially the algorithms. It's an echo chamber.
Absolutely.
They're only fed what they engage with, even if they don't believe in it. Can you explain what your research found about that?
Well, our research really looks at the ways in which these spaces enable a certain kind of socialisation. So the pathways and patterns of participation that lead boys and men into these kinds of spaces, and the way that, yeah, as you say, algorithms really do supercharge this kind of content. And it's kind of like a fire hose of stuff that people are receiving in their feeds. Even if they're not particularly interested, they'll get it anyway. So obviously that's not going to appeal to everybody, but it's appealing to enough people, and it's becoming enough of a problem that it's not simply an online issue. Obviously, online and offline can't really be separated, and we're seeing the ways in which this kind of content is then creating certain kinds of attitudes that are becoming very harmful, whether it's in schools, whether it's in workplaces, whether it's in the street, the kinds of attitudes towards women that are bred in these places, it's the demonisation, the reduction of women, and the inability of women to claim their full humanity in these spaces is something that we're very alarmed by, obviously. And as you say, the design of these social media platforms reinforces these architectures and these kinds of attitudes. And that's very much by design. I think that's one of the most alarming things, is it's not casual, it's not by chance, it's actually by design.
And there are also major concerns, Vivian, which is so much about what's wrong with our world today, is it's profit over people. And then there's this whole other element of this manosphere where it is about targeting certain people and also monetising that. So tell us about then how they target these young men and what they sell to them and the damage it is doing.
So, all teenagers, I think almost all of them, are insecure in some way, shape or form. They're going through big transitions, changes, and really what's happening in these spaces is those insecurities become a business opportunity. So, the kinds of, as you said before, I think before we started recording in the 90s, probably women were more susceptible to this kind of messaging, but now young men are being susceptible to it. So they're being targeted in what are assumed to be their insecurities, and then the kind of marketing that they're receiving through these spaces where they're monetising those insecurities is both creating them and reinforcing them, and then providing seeming solutions to some of these insecurities and anxieties that are legitimate, but ultimately really not providing any kind of long-term pathway out of those insecurities, in fact reinforcing them so that they do become more profitable over time. So it's really not in the interests of the boys and men involved in these spaces to stay in them, but it is understandable that they would be looking for answers in times of insecurity, especially in the world that we live in today, where there's so much inequality and there are so many legitimate grievances and perceived grievances that are then manufactured off the back of those legitimate grievances, that it isn't really a surprise that these spaces would have appeal for some people.
Vivian, there has been a lot of research saying this popularity of the manosphere certainly increased during COVID, and also whilst Me Too movement was incredibly important in calling out the perpetrators, that there wasn't a focus on this toxic behaviour. That was almost this commentary that all men are bad.
I think definitely some of the ideas that came with the Me Too movement, which are grounded in realities of really toxic behaviour, have at times, I think, led to a lot of, there's been huge trauma, obviously, as women have had to be subjected to the abuse in so many situations throughout society associated with patriarchy, and continue to be abused. And so I think the increased awareness of those kinds of abuses that came, fortunately, with the Me Too movement enabled more and more people to connect over their shared experiences of abuse and mistreatment. But at the same time, I think it potentially, what we've learnt from some men who we've spoken to in the Manosphere in the course of this project, is that some of them feel that therefore being a man is necessarily bad. And so there's that sense that rather than focusing on toxic behaviour, it's kind of casting masculinity itself as toxic, which, that's an important distinction to make. But sometimes I think those things can collapse into each other, so it becomes an idea that somehow being a man is a problem rather than certain behaviours are the problem. So I think that distinction sometimes can get lost, particularly in online spaces where things are reduced, the complexity is missing, the nuance is gone. People are encouraged to see in black and white. Polarisation actually gets rewarded online. If you're demonising and stigmatising and reducing, your content will travel further. So that need to retain the complexity and that relationality in these spaces, I think, really disappears. and does lead to much more reactivity in these spaces and feeds these kinds of ideas about the Me Too movement, which actually was very positive in so many ways, but it becomes reduced to this somehow it's all anti-men, when actually it's about really holding people to account for bad behaviour. Anyone could engage in that behaviour.
You make a great point there, Vivian, because how do we get that balance right? By calling out those perpetrators that deserve to face the consequences, but also to call out and focus on that specific behaviour rather than looking at it as a very, very black and white scenario.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think there are so many ways in which we can work with people who have behaved badly. Many of our systems are set up to do just that, but many of them also tend to reinforce the behaviour. And in fact, I think some of these spaces actually are really encouraging men to believe, actually, this behaviour isn't bad at all. There's nothing to be held to account. You haven't gone far enough. You know, that's the narrative that's coming out of some of the sort of Andrew Tate type people, whoever else is out there online. Really, it's about encouraging people to go further in the direction of sexism, further in the direction of racism, further in the direction of dehumanisation of women, and really treat them, you know, all out objects rather than trying to recalibrate. So I think, yeah, it's hard to see a way forward when we start to look at some of this content, but I think some of the promise is probably held in what people are also doing offline and what people are doing away from these algorithms, because yeah, a lot of people are very disenchanted as well with these sorts of spaces. And some of the men we've interviewed have talked about how for them it was really just a blip in their internet experience, in the sense that they really were lurking in some of these spaces during COVID, but they've since kind of left them, and rather than it being their whole world, it was a moment in time. So I think that's a promising narrative, that it's not actually so all-encompassing. And I think, you know, really most people want to live well together, and if we're following the kinds of advice that's promoted in the Manosphere, we're not going to be living well together. We're going to be living in ways that are very dehumanised and very much life-denying. If you think earlier, we were talking about a little about the looks-maxing trends, you know, the kinds of denial of life that those things promote, you know, the violence that sort of trend promotes for men to engage, you know. Yeah, you've probably seen some of the trends that have emerged in those spaces. I'm not sure whether you have, but yeah, very alarming trends towards an inability to accept oneself and actually to do violence to oneself to try and conform to an idea of what is going to be an attractive man.
Vivian, how much from an overall point of view do you think this manosphere, these very toxic, damaging behaviours, play into disrespect in our community and also violence?
I mean, we've seen how they play out, for example, in schools. You know, there's been a lot of really important work done by colleagues, you know, on the way that manosphere ideas have actually entered classrooms, and many female teachers particularly are now leaving the profession because they can't, you know, safely teach in these environments. They're being attacked, they're being denigrated in ways that are incredibly humiliating and harmful, and some are being, you know, women are being attacked more in the street. I don't have the statistics, but I think we know that this is creating real-world harms. And I think one of the things, even when it's not necessarily so overt, I think that the legitimisation of some of these attitudes, which has grown, and that's one of the things we talk about also in our article, is that I guess this monetisation has meant a whole lot of people have kind of onboarded, and the manosphere is no longer limited to maybe incel forums or men's rights cohorts, or, you know, there are all kinds of groups that were there at the sort of the manosphere's beginnings, but actually now it's very much more mainstream, as we track in our article, thanks to this monetisation as well. So that, you know, we talk about also the fact that it's not even just men promoting the attitudes anymore, it's also sort of the trad spaces, trad wife ideas that, you know, women are happiest when they're in the home, bearing children, not working outside the home, serving their husbands, and men are happiest when they're being providers, warriors, whatever. And that sort of essentialism of what people should be based on their gender is something I think that's become a hell of a lot more prevalent thanks to these online spaces and reinforced. I think that's a lasting thing that is much more prevalent perhaps than, you know, episodes of violence. But I think that kind of violence, I suppose, at the level of what people can be and do in their lives and how they're viewed and how they see themselves, I think that's the much more troubling thing, because that's really conditioning us culturally to think some of these ideas that really do take us back in time, really anti-feminist ideas, that they somehow become palatable, particularly to younger people.
Vivian, it's a massive question, and I wish we all had a solution to this, but from your work in this really important space, where do you think a possible solution is?
I don't think there's ever going to be just one solution to such a complex problem, but I think one of the things that we need to be doing is talking to each other, which sounds like a bit of a cliche, but creating spaces in which it's safe to speak freely and listen to one another in respectful ways. And I mean, that might involve being offline perhaps, or I know that we've seen also online, there are certain forums which some other scholars have tracked, for example, Reddit forums for people that used to be in a manosphere space that have since left it, and they found another kind of community that's actually an off-ramp from some of those attitudes, where they're able to talk in more complex ways about gender, about their own experiences, whether it's dating or whether it's the way they feel about their looks or whatever it might be. So those insecurities then get aired in a more a kind of environment that isn't just shutting them down, that isn't telling them they have to be in a particular way, but it actually is acknowledging them more in their complexity. So I think those spaces are promising. I think the role of education, of course, is always very important, and how we fund and resource educational settings for young people, providing them with what they need to feel meaningfully engaged in the world, so these spaces have less appeal. Because I think one of the things we see, not just in the manosphere, but in other areas where young people might be getting involved in quite extreme spaces, is they're looking for some purpose and meaning in the world. They're looking to create a sense of dignity for themselves. They might want to they might want to stand out. They might want to do something that makes them feel they've achieved. And so if we can enable young people to find those spaces outside of some of these manosphere or other extremist arenas, we'll have a much better chance of not perpetrating or perpetuating these kinds of ideas. And really, that's a question of resources that people have access to and can mobilise. It's a question of, what are we actually resourcing for young people? What kinds of life possibilities do they have? Because I think as long as we're living in a world of increasing inequality, where a whole generation at the moment seems pretty much locked out of the possibility of having, being able to own a home, for example, unless they're in the minority, it means that these kinds of ideas are going to keep having a hold, because there doesn't seem to be much of an alternative. There doesn't seem to be a lot of hope. And so why not turn towards them? If the world is not really listening and it's kind of failing younger people, well, then they will look elsewhere. So I think as long as we continue to work at that level of resourcing as well as messaging, not just one or the other, but working together and listening, then I think that will give us a hope of moving beyond some of this content. I can already see also signs of hope in a number of articles that I've read since the start of this year that suggest social media is really kind of on the decline. People are turning increasingly away from it. They're sick of all the ads. So I hope that holds, and I hope that's also true for younger people and not just for people my age. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure what you think about that.
It's a great point. Listening to our younger generation and also giving them hope. It's so important. Thank you so much for giving a voice to this really important conversation. Thanks, Vivian.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk. Great to talk to you, Natarsha.
That was radicalisation researcher Vivian Gerrard. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back tomorrow with the weekend briefing. Sasha is joined by comedian Will Anderson.
Comedy is at its best when people can say whatever it is they want to say, I believe. If you say something, then you have the responsibility to just be able to justify or back up or stand by what it is that you say. And if you have gone too far, have the opportunity to learn from that, tell people why you think you've gone too far. These are all great things. These are all great things both in comedy and outside comedy. We want to grow, we want to learn, we want to evolve.
We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. See you next time.